silence wasn't just silence when it started inside the guarded doors of Windsor Castle. It was the kind of judgment that weighed heavily on a man who had been carrying too much for too long. King Charles sat by himself at the long mahogany table, staring at the document in front of him while his pen trembled. His voice, hoarse with tiredness, broke the silence just as the ink was starting to dry. "I've decided what to do." 4 words: devastating, calm, and purposeful. They were unforgettable to all who heard them. Beneath that declaration was a choice that would destroy years of fragile allegiance, shatter the monarchy's reputation, and reveal a reality Charles had concealed behind decades of duty and denial. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any updates before we delve further into what this actually implies for the royal family. Only 4 reliable advisors had been called, and the hour was late. Folks who had seen kings come and go, but had never seen one so obviously divided between crown and heart. Pale in the flickering candlelight, Charles's face revealed exhaustion rather than strength. His hands shook not from aging but from guilt. His mother, the late queen, spoke about legacy, sacrifice, and the difficulty of choosing what is right over what is convenient, and her words continued to reverberate in his mind. Despite his logic, he was unable to shake the unsettling notion that his throne would become a battlefield at this very time, and with this signature. He had defended everything for years by claiming to be a man of contemporary morals who looked to love and friendship for atonement. However, he had discovered that in the House of Windsor, love was a terrible currency. Once concealed by courteous smiles and royal propriety, the fissures have grown into chasms. The monarch's own heart was in revolt, and the institution that had withstood war, scandal, and exile was now dealing with its most intimate crises. Thus, in that silent room, he presented the choice as a corrective, a moral realignment in a kingdom that had long forgotten morality, rather than a betrayal. Another piece of paper, a private crest draft that was supposed to have Camilla's queen consort seal on it, was on the desk. It represented her long-fought position next to him, acceptance and cooperation. For a long time, Charles gazed at it as though it held the culmination of all his mistakes. Then, calmly and deliberately, he struck a match and watched it burn. Soft and final, smoke curled upward, carrying with it years of personal guilt and national dispute. The room was filled with the smell of burning paper, a conclusion that passed for purification. The castle slept beyond those doors, oblivious to the fact that the monarchy's path had just changed irrevocably. The aides who saw were caught between obligation and incredulity. Charles remained silent as one of them muttered, "Your Majesty, this will change everything." His gaze remained on the window, where dawn's faint shape was visible through the glass. Unaware that the foundation underlying it had already begun to fracture, the outer world continued to believe in the appearance of harmony. The whispering started by daybreak. Fragments of cautious, cryptic, and terrified talks were conveyed through the palace hallways. "It's been done," one assistant whispered to another. At first, the news traveled around staff quarters like an invisible wind, whispering, "He's chosen." Employees avoided making eye contact. Advisors moved more quickly. A private summons to summon the Princess of Wales to Windsor under the pretense of a private audience was being planned somewhere in another wing of the castle. There was no going back for Charles. He felt oddly at peace despite the fact that what he had done could not be undone. He had opted for truth over delusion, legacy over ease. The monarchy, that long-standing stronghold of ritual and quiet, was going to be held accountable for its own actions. Long after he had left the room, the echoes of his words, "I've made my choice," continued to reverberate throughout the castle as the sun rose. However, one thing became evident when Buckingham's marble hallways were illuminated by the dawn light. The monarchy itself would change forever. Camilla's morning started with a crisp silence that felt intimate in a palace where every gesture was practiced and every word was filtered through layers of formality. No briefings were placed next to her breakfast plate, her private secretary did not gently knock, and her daily schedule was not mentioned. Once steady and reassuring, the cadence of royal life had become unsettlingly quiet. In the slightest of ways, she was the first to notice. There was no sign of her assistant, who had never skipped a morning greeting. Then, like a slow, terrible tide, came the realization. The morning bulletins that went through Buckingham's internal channels had no mention of her name, Her Majesty, the Queen Consort. Her hard-won identity and armor had been those 3 words for years, and suddenly they were gone. Camilla grabbed her phone in an attempt to find comfort, but there was none. No one picked up when she called. The lines that used to bend with haste when she called, the lines that she had always commanded, now bore only the chill of avoidance. Even her private secretary spoke in half-truths that revealed more than they covered, sounding reserved and practiced. "His Majesty is in consultation," he murmured incoherently. However, the tone said everything. Without her, a significant change had taken place. By lunchtime, a staff leak, rather than family or advisors, was the source of the rumors. Whispers carried a single forwarded message. Overnight, the king's choice became official. Internal machinery had already turned, even though no public declaration had been made yet. All ceremonial duties were to be performed by Catherine, the Princess of Wales. With weak breath, Camilla gazed at the message, repeatedly tracing the words with her eyes. The loss of her crown did not break her. It was the approach. It was a brutality only the crown could inflict, to be simply erased in administrative terminology, after decades of struggling to gain legitimacy. She withdrew and closed herself up in Clarence's house, the only place that still seemed like hers. This was the stronghold she had constructed for years to fend against mockery, public contempt, and the specters of an unforgettable past. And suddenly it felt like the walls were getting closer, even here. Silence engulfed her for hours as she sat there, reliving the years, the late-night fights, the never-ending press skirmishes, and the battle to be perceived as a woman who supported and loved her monarch, rather than as an intruder. She had thought she had finally won the battle for dignity, which had been fought at every turn. But now there was no escaping the reality. Under the weight of the crown, the love that had once defied convention had become icy. Public communications teams fumbled behind palace doors. The story had already broken free of containment, but no formal statement could be made until the story was developed. Senior courtiers argued on timing, tone, and whether to describe it as temporary or transitional. They talked as if they were talking about a press release rather than someone's demise. Nobody understood how perception functioned in this world as Camilla did. Being silent did not provide protection. It was a decision. Sympathy became stronger the longer she remained silent. Outside, people began to speculate, still not knowing the whole truth. What had caused her to vanish from events? Why had Catherine suddenly started showing up for briefings instead of her? The tabloids became more ravenous, and the questions became louder. Camilla had a gut feeling that her humiliation was just the start, that soon sympathy would give way to controversy, and that the palace would once more struggle to keep what it could no longer manage under control. As Camilla's quiet grew, another woman was getting ready for a test of fate, rather than a kingdom. Catherine thought it was just another routine when she was called to Windsor, briefing a private conversation regarding charitable events, appearances, and possibly a public release. However, the air bore a burden that no timetable could account for when she entered the private room. Charles stood by the window like a tired man looking for forgiveness rather than as a ruler giving orders. When he did speak, his voice was shaky. "You are the one who will save the monarchy." Like a crown she had never requested to wear, the words fell. She remained silent for a moment. Both of them were unable to break the reverent yet oppressive stillness that enveloped them. Catherine's initial reaction was incredulity. She reasoned that it had to be a mistake, possibly a symbolic gesture, a short-term agreement until things were resolved. However, Charles's speech betrayed the truth with its tone. There was no formality here. The choice was definitive. He described a tired country, headlines that ridiculed rather than praised, and a monarchy whose very existence, he said, was in jeopardy. Beyond his words, his eyes conveyed a disturbing concern that he had lost both the respect of his people and authority over his reign. Even though the world no longer believed in him, he now tried to restore that image through her, through the woman the world respected, trusted, and believed in. However, something darker weighed on Catherine. It wasn't an honor. It was a burden that was skillfully disguised as obligation. She had been walking the tightrope between being seen and remaining silent for years, juggling public adoration with personal constraint. It was unimaginable to be the face of a decision that overthrew another woman who was still residing behind the palace walls. Her sense of justice, her silent reverence for the late Queen's customs, and her allegiance to William all collided violently. "I can't," she muttered almost to herself. "I'm not allowed to take this." But Charles moved forward, worn out but resolute. He whispered, "It's not about what's yours. It's about what needs to endure." His statements conveyed the anguish of a guy who has witnessed everything he thought was unassailable fall apart. He acknowledged that the crown, which had previously represented strength, now felt like a relic, shaking beneath the weight of a society that no longer held it in high regard. He was concerned that the palace had turned into a place of shame rather than dignity, because scandals had damaged public confidence. He acknowledged that he had failed to uphold the moral core of the monarchy, and that while the title of his reign continued to shine, its intent had faded. "You are the bridge," he said to her in a broken voice. "The people see in you what I have lost." However, Catherine was conflicted. Accepting would be betraying Camilla, a woman she could still feel sympathy for but did not love. Refusing would be tantamount to disobeying a king and jeopardizing the stability of her husband's patrimony. The silence that followed spoke enough, but the discussion came to no conclusion. She nodded her head slightly, not in agreement but in recognition of the kindness one extends to a fate they are unable to yet reject. As she departed, Charles watched over her with eyes that conveyed a mixture of thankfulness and sadness, as if he had imposed a curse under the garb of obligation. Long after she got home that evening, a sealed letter showed up. Unmistakable, massive, and final, it bore the king's crest. Sensing that whatever was within would alter everything, she hesitated before shattering the wax. The woman who had been mute would suddenly be compelled to take action because there were words inside that would ignite both rage and destiny. It wasn't a royal proclamation. Each line of the confession, which was penned in Charles's shaky handwriting, carried the weight of decades spent juggling shame and power. It appeared to be a straightforward letter with the king's crest on it. However, the soul of a man at odds with himself was hidden beneath those creases. "Once it started, I made a bad decision, and I won't die doing it again." The foundation of the monarchy was permanently altered the instant those words were read. It went beyond regret. It was an acknowledgement that the decisions made by its bearer had tarnished the crown that had been polished for the world. For hours, Catherine read and reread the letter as if its meaning would alter, her palms chilly against the page. The monarch had written as a man acknowledging his shortcomings and his faith rather than as a ruler. He talked about responsibility over ease and legacy over love. He acknowledged that fear, not malice, had led him to decide to deprive Camilla of her responsibilities. Fear that the public's disdain might cause the monarchy to fall. He wrote, "I have lived long enough to know that love cannot steady a crown. Nevertheless, I gave it my all." He summed up the decades he had spent standing up for the woman who was now by herself in Clarence's home in a single sentence. Another insight struck Catherine like a velvet-clad sword. There was a paragraph in the midst of the letter that she found hard to trust. "Before she closed her eyes to defend what you and William stood for, your late grandmother-in-law asked me. She was afraid that if her legacy didn't pass via you, it would die with her." When Catherine realized that the choice wasn't solely about her, her breath hitched. It was about granting an unspoken wish of Queen Elizabeth. Until Charles could no longer stand the guilt, she was kept in the dark about a fact she had never been supposed to know. The last words of the letter were unlike anything ever written by a king. It was an apology to the two women. He was never certain Camilla should wear the crown he gave her. To Catherine for giving her a burden under the pretense of fate. He wrote, "Pardon me for what this will cost you." Loyalty never comes at an equal cost. After the letter left the palace walls, that one statement would go on to become the most quoted sentence in Britain for weeks to come. Who leaked it was unknown. Some claimed it was a close friend of Charles's who was trying to make him more relatable before the storm. Others muttered that it was intentional, a diversion created by the palace to lessen the impact of what was about to happen. However, the timing was crucial. The letter first surfaced in the hands of a few journalists who saw its explosive potential just days before the formal announcement. It took over every front page in a matter of hours. Betrayal, regret, and a monarchy split between heart and crown were all over the headlines. Britain turned into a battleground for ideologies. Charles's candor was praised by some, who saw it as his first genuinely human gesture as king. Others denounced him, calling it cowardice disguised as morality. Talk shows discussed morality. Every word was dissected by news panels, and the public divided between those who supported Camilla and those who believed Catherine would be the next big thing. For the first time in many years, the monarchy seemed more like a confession made in front of its subjects than an institution. One thing remained constant despite the flurry of headlines and divergent viewpoints. Something much more than controversy had been triggered by the king's statements. They had revealed the weakness of a silent kingdom. Buckingham Palace was getting ready for the announcement that would usher in a new era of royalty, while the world discussed Charles's morality. The palace issued a statement at precisely 6 o'clock that was so succinct and well-phrased that it sent shivers down the spine of the entire kingdom. Queen Camilla will relinquish her formal responsibilities. Ceremonial duties will be taken on by the Princess of Wales. Just 30 words. 30 words that shattered centuries of royal custom. In a matter of minutes, all of Britain's phones, radios, and television screens became silent before erupting into anarchy. The monarchy, that long-standing emblem of authority, had just collapsed in the most visible way imaginable. And for the first time in recorded history, the nation's focus was not on the crown. It was the crack underneath it. The headlines arrived quickly and brutally. Charles overthrows his queen. A new force emerges. The home split. From London to Los Angeles, analysts were frantically trying to figure out what the language meant. Don't quit. Take a step back. Ceremonial duties rather than power. It was wording used to hide a revolt. But there was no denying the reality. The monarch had taken the unthinkable step of depriving his own wife of her position of authority, replacing her with Catherine, the silent Queen of Britain, rather than a politician or an heir. The air crackled with incredulity outside Buckingham Palace. Crowds assembled, divided between amazement and indignation. Demonstrators yelled, demanding responsibility. Supporters called it a restoration of dignity and shed tears of relief. Some saw it as long overdue justice and the end of an unsettling era. Others saw it as a husband's ultimate humiliation of the woman who had supported him through every controversy, a betrayal of the highest caliber. The palace gates turned into a platform for conflict, emotion, and uncertainty. The royal family saw their world divided in two behind those iron fences. The king's countenance was calm but lifeless when he eventually made an appearance in front of the cameras. His sentences were calculated and dispassionate, as though he were reading a screenplay he no longer trusted. Prince William, however, was clearly uncomfortable next to him. His jaw was clenched and his eyes were far away. He had always supported the institution's stability and the notion that change must occur gradually and tastefully. He appeared to be a man who realized he was seeing implosion rather than growth as he stood next to his father. But Catherine was nowhere to be seen. No words, no appearance, no recognition of her abrupt descent. Her quiet turned into a shield. She provided nothing, no defense, no denial, no appreciation, in a tempest of conjecture and fury. Her mystery was only enhanced by her reserve. Those who knew her recognized something more profound than what the media called strategy. A woman unwilling to take credit for a win that occurred at the expense of someone else. No royal proclamation could match the impact of her silence. Camilla's absence, meanwhile, was overwhelming. No pictures, no sightings, no words. Whispers filled the void as the press was shut out of Clarence House's hallways. Some said she was sick, distraught, and living alone. Others suggested that she had completely fled the nation, withdrawing to a peaceful estate remote from the mayhem. The monarchy's publicity staff found it difficult to keep control as each rumor fueled the flames. Political leaders were already estimating the price behind the scenes. Uncertain of the extent of the impact, constitutional advisors prepared backup plans. Was this a forerunner to something far more unsettling, or was it just a symbolic shuffle? In order to avoid taking sides, the Prime Minister's staff said nothing. The monarchy was untouchable from the beginning. However, this disaster was self-inflicted. And one fact became indisputable as Britain watched, shocked and split. This was no longer a power narrative. It has to do with surviving. However, the public square was not the real battlefield. It was the actual royal lineage, now split between pride, duty, and retaliation. The palace was no longer a place to live by midnight. Whispers were all over the place, the kind that carried danger instead of wonder. Those who had previously quietly obeyed the crown suddenly moved like shadows, siding with the woman the king had rejected rather than the king himself. Alliances were being redrawn in quiet hallways and secret rooms. Under the guise of worry, Camilla's sister and a few devoted courtiers assembled with the intention of rebelling. They talked about honor, reputation, retaliation, and most importantly, making sure that Camilla's disobedience would write history rather than Catherine's victory. Charles misjudged the silent rage of people who had centered their lives around Camilla's rise. But he thought he had found atonement in his choice, that his sacrifice of love for legacy would restore the monarchy's moral equilibrium. They perceived what he viewed as purification as treachery. Therefore, the counterattack started through story rather than confrontation. Stories that were carefully planted started to make their way into the media. They were subtle enough to be denied, strong enough to cause pain, and whispered hints that Catherine was going too far, unwilling and unfit for leadership. The picture of perfection that had rendered her untouchable was intended to be undermined by tiny doubts, reinforced by repetition. Even before the headlines emerged, Catherine sensed the change inside the palace. Her eyes, which had previously met hers with respect, suddenly expressed caution as the air around her got colder. Her voice was steady yet strained as she confided exclusively in William. She responded, "They'll try to make me the villain," and he was unable to reassure her for once. He had known since birth that the crown did not shield it from being devoured. Both of them felt the weight of quiet. Every courteous wave and grin they gave in public turned into a show to cover up their dread that invisible forces were working against them. The leaks followed. Once zealously devoted to the throne, tabloids started reporting on the king's declining health. The articles came out at a crucial moment, right after the public discussion about the royal handover had subsided. People began to wonder if Charles was sick. Was he even capable of making such a choice? Had Camilla's removal been a guy losing clarity instead of gaining it back? What started out as rumors swiftly became a political storm. It was too late when advisors hurried to control the fallout. The organization had started to consume itself. Charles and Camilla met one last time in the little private chapel they used to go to together on more peaceful days, amid the pandemonium. There were no witnesses or cameras between them, only the truth. He did not ask for pardon, nor did she ask for reconciliation. They had a final melancholy and somber talk. "You may strip my title," Camilla murmured, shattering the silence, "but not my truth." It was both a curse and a promise, one that would haunt him long after she turned and left. As she left, Charles realized that the fight for salvation had become far more sinister. What started out as an attempt to preserve the monarchy had turned into an uncontrollable internal conflict. And as the palace prepared for peace, destiny dealt the unexpected blow. Everything was altered by a single picture. It wasn't a statement, a speech, or a scandal. Only one picture of Camilla leaving a secret facility in London. Red eyes and a tearful face. In a matter of hours, the image was on every device, feed, and main page. The headline said, "Betrayed and broken." The public's sympathies changed like a tide as a result. The once vilified woman was now a representation of silent sorrow. The fact that no one was aware of the image's true meaning was irrelevant. The harm had already been done. Once based on elegance and silence, the monarchy's precarious moral order started to disintegrate under the weight of public criticism. Soon after, there were rumors of breakdowns, restless nights, and unanswered letters. According to unnamed insiders, the palace was filled with bewilderment and despair. Even royal loyalists started to doubt the cost of the crown for the first time. Tragedy was woven into the web of power through implication rather than official routes. From behind the palace gates, Charles observed the mayhem that was taking place. Every instinct in him was split. He wanted to get in touch with Camilla, console her, and make amends for what he had done. However, personal repentance was not acceptable to the crown. Every act of generosity ran the risk of being interpreted as weakness. The exact order he had battled to reinstate was challenged by every act of empathy. Convincing himself that quiet was a sign of charity when, in reality, it was cowardice, he did nothing. Silently, Catherine endured the worst of the storm. She exuded the same unwavering composure that had won her millions of admirers. But under the surface, she was being torn apart by guilt. She was regarded as noble and dignified by the globe. However, she was unable to get rid of the picture of Camilla's suffering or the realization that she had turned into the public face of someone else's shame. Every public appearance turned into a challenge, and every smile served as a cover for a pain she was afraid to express. Even though she never requested authority, she suddenly felt that it defined who she was. Suddenly, the woman who had always chosen kindness was perceived as the cause of the fall of another woman's crown. William saw the toll it was taking and detested the machine that needed his wife's calm at the expense of her tranquility. His anger boiled quietly next to her, protective but helpless. This was not politics to him. It was brutality. However, emotion had no place in the palace. His father was uncompromising in his resolve. The press turned his mother-in-law's suffering into a weapon, and his wife was caught in the perfect storm of duty, love, and loyalty. William realized for the first time what it meant to inherit both a throne and its curse. The church quietly intervened as the issue grew. Senior clerics asked Charles to think about reconciliation behind closed doors. A symbolic gesture for the stability of the realm, if not for love. To restore moral order, they reasoned, there should be a gathering, a prayer, and a message of forgiveness. However, even the church was aware of it. The foundation of the monarchy was crumbling. No news release or royal procession could hide the spiritual crisis that had developed from what had started out as a personal decision. The public's opinion broke down entirely. Once applauding Catherine's grace, crowds now called for responsibility. She was accused of cruelty by silence by the same newspapers that had hailed her as the monarchy's savior. The harsh paradox of monarchy was to be loved until one's goodness became a hindrance. And Buckingham's glittering facade started to fade as the country's sorrow gave way to indignation. However, Catherine was already getting ready for something else as the kingdom lamented the mayhem, and the sound of division resounded through the streets. A speech that will permanently alter her destiny. Catherine stood in front of a divided country beneath the imposing arches of Paul's Cathedral. Her voice was solid yet tinged with sadness, and her presence was both commanding and delicate. She said, "I did not ask for this," and those 5 words put an end to all the murmurs in the hallway. They weren't prepared by the speechwriters in the palace, they weren't practiced, and the monarch didn't approve them. The remarks of a lady who had carried both praise and resentment on her shoulders and was now prepared to face both were honest, genuine, and unvarnished. Her voice faltered just enough to show that there was suffering, a profound personal tiredness that could no longer be concealed, beneath the elegance that the world loved. She talked as a woman, not a princess, pleading with her nation to see past titles and crowns. The crowd held their breath as she whispered, "We have mistaken strength for silence and love for loyalty to power. I have been both blessed and broken by what this crown represents." There was merely an unreserved appeal for forgiveness, no proclamations of triumph or defenses of her new position. She offered Camilla forgiveness rather than denial or explanation. She went on, her voice shaking, "To those who have been hurt by change, please know that your suffering is in my heart. In the defeat of another, there was never victory." In other words, Catherine accomplished what no royal proclamation could. Overcame the gap between responsibility and compassion. As she stretched to her chest and unclasped the royal pin and the symbol of her new power, the audience gazed in awestruck reverence. It glinted for a moment before she put it down in a daring yet modest gesture. The ensuing hush was electrifying. Speeches could never express what that one act did. She was neither a queen by conquest nor a pawn of palace politics. She was a woman who prioritized honesty over appearances. Something changed even for those who had criticized her. The icy machinery of the monarchy gave way to a deeply human frailty in that church. Charles observed from a quiet pew in the rear, his lined, pale face displaying an uncontrollable torrent of emotion. His hands shook as she talked, gripping the edge of his chair as if the concept of kingship itself were being held together. Her words pierced him with truth rather than accusation. He had thought that by taking charge and changing the monarchy to fit his vision, he might rescue it. However, he now realized that Catherine had saved it by showing compassion and giving up. The weight he had been carrying for years seemed to lift with every word she said. Knowing that her elegance had accomplished what his strength could never accomplish, redemption in the eyes of the people, he sobbed silently behind the low light. The response was immediate outside the cathedral. Once viewed as cautious, commentators now praised her for her bravery. Her humble speech stunned the media, which published headlines referring to it as the speech that healed the crown. Instead of protesting, crowds gathered in the streets to cry. After being shattered for months, the monarchy unexpectedly developed a heartbeat once more, one of empathy rather than dominance. However, a subtle sense of finality persisted among the admiration. The stillness before a choice that had been simmering in Charles's heart for weeks was palpable to those who knew him. There was silence, the kind that occurs when a country realizes it has watched something permanent, as Catherine's last words reverberated through the cathedral, her voice low but firm. Her address was more than a show of solidarity. It was a blessing over an unidentified conclusion. One man realized what he had to do while the crowd marveled at her bravery. One last act of fate remained as the echoes of her words vanished into the arched ceilings, the abdication that nobody could have imagined. The palace was motionless at dawn, unaware that a monarch was getting ready to terminate his reign, not by defeat or death, but by choice. The outer world slept. With the crown resting silently in his hands and weighing more than before, Charles strolled through the gardens by himself. There were just the early light, the chilly air, and the weight of a choice that might change his legacy. No cameras, no aides, and no audience. "I've made my choice," he muttered once again. However, the words this time had nothing to do with authority or control. They were about the kind of peace that only results from giving up. The idea had been with him like an unspoken fact for weeks. Catherine's speech had done more than just mend the country. It had revealed to him a reflection of the modest, loyal, and sincere man he had once vowed to be. He came to see that his crown had become a cage rather than a calling, and that the monarchy could only endure by restoring its purpose rather than retaining its authority. Thus, he penned a letter that would alter everything by himself and by hand. It was not fashioned by politics or prescribed by advisors. It was a liberating act. He wrote, "I served as I could. However, the time has come for love to take precedence over the law." Before dawn, the royal crimson-sealed letter was discreetly put in the Prime Minister's box. However, he had to mend the tie that had previously defined his entire life before he could relinquish his rule. He requested to see Camilla in Clarence's private rooms. When she came in, there was just the mutual understanding of two people who had lost equally and loved strongly, rather than any hint of the resentment that had formerly tainted their parting remarks. "I never stopped caring," he said, his voice cracking, "but I could no longer let love be my sin." Camilla, with tears of pride and sorrow in her eyes, only nodded. "Then go with grace, Charles," she said. Later that morning, William and Catherine were called to the king's private study. The room felt heavy with historical portraits of monarchs who had held on to power, men and women who had ruled until time itself took their thrones, but Charles stood apart from them, looking at his son as a father facing his own reflection rather than as a sovereign addressing an heir. "You will do better," he said, resting a hand on William's shoulder. "And you will remind him that this crown belongs to the people before I do." There were no ceremonial gestures or official blessings, just the transfer of trust and a private heritage of mercy and duty. The globe was in disbelief when the announcement was made hours later. A British king has resigned voluntarily for the first time in contemporary history. A royal representative read a straightforward yet powerful message. "I discovered purpose in service. I find serenity in moving aside." Outside Buckingham Palace, crowds gathered in shock, some crying, others amazed. Charles placed the crown on a table, its brilliance catching the morning sun one last time. There was no broadcast abdication or handover, just a symbolic gesture witnessed by relatives. Charles spoke about humanity rather than monarchy or power in his parting address to the country. He claimed that the heart that has the courage to forgive is where power is found, not the crown. Speaking with dignity and humility, such comments reverberated well beyond the boundaries of Britain. A new dawn, one of redemption rather than scandal or shame, broke across the country as he left the palace as Charles, the man who had carried love and hardship in equal measure, rather than as king. As Britain awoke that morning, the tale of "I've made my choice" evolved from a royal scandal to a contemporary tale of strength, selflessness, and forgiveness. The narrative of a monarch who ultimately opted for peace over power and, as a result, discovered the redemption that history had long denied.